Taste by Roald Dahl. There were 6 of us to dinner that night at Mike Schofield's house in London. Mike and his wife and daughter, my wife and I, and a man called Richard Pratt. Richard Pratt was a famous gourmet. He was president of a small society known as the Epicures, and each month he circulated privately to its members a pamphlet on food and wines. He organized dinners where sumptuous dishes and rare wines were served. He refused to smoke for fear of harming his palate, and when discussing a wine he had a curious, rather droll habit of referring to it as though it were a living being. "A prudent wine," he would say, "rather diffident and evasive, but quite prudent," or "a good-humoured wine, benevolent and cheerful, slightly obscene, perhaps, but none the less good-humoured." I had been to dinner at Mike's twice before, when Richard Pratt was there, and on each occasion Mike and his wife had gone out of their way to produce a special meal for the famous gourmet, and this one, clearly, was to be no exception. The moment we entered the dining room I could see that the table was laid for a feast. The tall candles, the yellow roses, the quantity of shining silver, the 3 wine glasses to each person, and above all the faint scent of roasting meat from the kitchen brought the first warm oozings of saliva to my mouth. As we sat down, I remembered that on both Richard Pratt's previous visits Mike had played a little betting game with him over the claret, challenging him to name its breed and its vintage. Pratt had replied that this should not be difficult provided it was one of the great years. Mike had then bet him a case of the wine in question that he could not do it. Pratt had accepted and had won both times. Tonight I felt sure the little game would be played over again, for Mike was quite willing to lose the bet in order to prove that his wine was good enough to be recognized, and Pratt, for his part, seemed to take a grave, restrained pleasure in displaying his knowledge. The meal began with a plate of whitebait, fried very crisp in butter, and to go with it there was a Moselle. Mike got up and poured the wine himself, and when he sat down again I could see he was watching Richard Pratt. He had set the bottle in front of me so I could read the label. It said Guerseley Oglisberg, 1945. He leaned over and whispered to me that Guerseley was a tiny village in the Moselle, almost unknown outside Germany. He said that this wine we were drinking was something unusual, that the output of the vineyard was so small that it was almost impossible for a stranger to get any of it. He had visited Guerseley personally the previous summer in order to obtain the few dozen bottles that they had finally allowed him to have. "I doubt anyone else in the country has any of it at the moment," he said. I saw him glance again at Richard Pratt. "Great thing about Moselle," he continued, raising his voice. "It's the perfect wine to serve before a claret. A lot of people serve a Rhine wine instead, but that's because they don't know any better. A Rhine wine will kill a delicate claret, don't you know that? It's barbaric to serve a Rhine before a claret, but a Moselle, a Moselle is exactly right." Mike Schofield was an amiable, middle-aged man, but he was a stockbroker. To be precise, he was a jobber in the stock market, and like a number of his kind, he seemed to be somewhat embarrassed, almost ashamed to find that he had made so much money with so slight a talent. In his heart he knew that he was not really much more than a bookmaker, an unctuous, infinitely respectable, secretly unscrupulous bookmaker, and he knew that his friends knew it too. So he was seeking now to become a man of culture, to cultivate a literary and aesthetic taste, to collect painting, music, books, and all the rest of it. His little sermon about Rhine wine and Moselle was just a part of this thing, this culture that he sought. "A charming little wine, don't you think?" he said. He was still watching Richard Pratt. I could see him give a rapid, furtive glance down the table each time he dropped his head to take a mouthful of whitebait. I could almost feel him waiting for the moment when Pratt would take his first sip, and look up from his glass with a smile of pleasure, of astonishment, perhaps even of wonder. And then there would be discussion, and Mike would tell him about the village of Guerseley. But Richard Pratt did not taste his wine. He was completely engrossed in conversation with Mike's 18-year-old daughter, Louise. He was half turned towards her, smiling at her, telling her, so far as I could gather, some story about a chef in a Paris restaurant. As he spoke he leaned closer and closer to her, seeming in his eagerness almost to impinge upon her, and the poor girl leaned as far as she could away from him, nodding politely, rather desperately, and not looking at his face but at the topmost button of his dinner jacket. We finished the fish, and the maid came around, removing the plates. When she came to Pratt, she saw that he had not yet touched his food, so she hesitated, and Pratt noticed her. He waved her away, broke off his conversation, and quickly began to eat, popping the little crisp brown fish quickly into his mouth with rapid jabbing movements of his fork. Then, when he had finished, he reached for his glass, and in 2 short swallows he tipped the wine down his throat and turned immediately to resume his conversation with Louise Schofield. Mike saw it all. I was conscious of him sitting there, very still, containing himself, looking at his guest. His round, jovial face seemed to loosen slightly and sag. But he contained himself, and was still, and said nothing. Soon the maid came forward with the second course. This was a large roast of beef. She placed it on the table in front of Mike, who stood up and carved it, cutting the slices very thin, laying them gently on the plates for the maid to take around. When he had served everyone, including himself, he put down the carving knife and leaned forward with both hands on the edge of a table. "Now," he said, speaking to all of us, but looking at Richard Pratt, "now for the claret. I must go and fetch the claret, if you'll excuse me." "You go and fetch it, Mike," I said. "Where is it?" "In the study with the cork out, breathing." "Why the study?" "Acquiring room temperature, of course. It's been there 24 hours. "But why the study?" "It was the best place in the house. Richard helped me choose it last time he was here." At the sound of his name, Pratt looked around. "That's right, isn't it?" Mike said. "Yes," Pratt answered, nodding gravely. "That's right." "On top of the green filing cabinet in my study," Mike said. "That's the place we chose. A good draught-free spot in a room with an even temperature. Excuse me now, will you, while I fetch it?" The thought of another wine to play with had restored his humour, and he hurried out at the door, to return a minute later more slowly, walking softly, holding in both hands a wine basket in which a dark bottle lay. The label was out of sight, facing downwards. "Now," he cried with his name as he came towards the table, "what about this one, Richard? You'll never name this one." Richard Pratt turned slowly and looked up at Mike. Then his eyes travelled down to the bottle nestling in a small wicker basket, and he raised his eyebrows, a slight supercilious arching of the eyebrows, and with it a pushing outwards of the wet lower lip, suddenly imperious and ugly. "You'll never get it," Mike said. "Not in 100 years." "A claret?" Richard Pratt said, condescending. "Of course. I assume, then, it's one from the smaller vineyards." "Perhaps it is, Richard. Then again, perhaps it isn't." "But is it a good year? One of the great years?" "Yes, I can guarantee that." "Then it shouldn't be too difficult," Richard Pratt said, drawling his words, looking slightly bored. Except that, to me, there was something strange about his drawling and his boredom. Between the eyes a shadow of something evil, and in his bearing an intentness that gave me a faint sense of uneasiness as I watched him. "This one is really rather difficult," Mike said. "I won't force you to bet on this one." "Indeed? And why not?" Again the slow arching of the brows, the cool, intent look. "Because it's difficult. That is not complimentary to me, you know." "My dear man," Mike said, "I'll bet you with pleasure, if that's what you wish." "It shouldn't be too hard to name it." "You mean you want to bet?" "I'm perfectly willing to bet," Richard Pratt said. "All right, then, we'll have the usual, a case of the wine itself." "You don't think I'll be able to name it, do you?" "As a matter of fact, with all due respect, I don't," Mike said. He was making some effort to remain polite, but Pratt was not bothering overmuch to conceal his contempt for the whole proceeding, and yet, curiously, his next question seemed to betray a certain interest. "You like to increase the bet?" "No, Richard, a case is plenty." "Would you like to bet 50 cases?" "That would be silly." Mike stood very still behind his chair at the head of a table, carefully holding the bottle in its ridiculous wicker basket. There was a trace of whiteness around his nostrils now, and his mouth was shut very tight. Pratt was lolling back in his chair, looking up at him, the eyebrows raised, the eyes half closed, a little smile touching the corners of his lips. And again I saw, or thought I saw, something distinctly disturbing about the man's face, that shadow of intentness between the eyes, and in the eyes themselves, right in their centres where it was black, a small, slow spark of shrewdness, hiding.